There are places on this continent where time itself seems to pool and deepen, where the land holds secrets in layers of soil and stone that stretch back beyond the reach of written memory. Stand on the wind-swept tundra of Alaska as autumn light slants low across the horizon, or walk through the cottonwood groves along a slow-moving river in Montana, and you might feel it, a presence faint and elusive, like the echo of footsteps that passed this way long ago. These are the landscapes of deep time, where the first peoples of North America left their marks in forms both enduring and fragile, a scatter of worked stone beside an ancient stream bed, the charcoal of a cooking fire preserved beneath millennia of sediment, bones emerging from permafrost that has held them frozen since before the pyramids rose in Egypt. The search for human origins in North America is an act of archaeology, but is also an act of imagination. We peer backward through thousands of years, assembling fragments into narratives, trying to understand when the first people arrived on this vast continent, where they came from, how they lived and adapted and eventually flourished across landscapes that ranged from Arctic ice fields to subtropical swamps. The evidence is scattered and incomplete. Much has been lost to time, organic materials decayed, sites buried or washed away, the ephemeral traces of mobile peoples who built with wood and hide rather than stone. What remains are glimpses, a spear point embedded in the rib of an extinct bison, a hearthstone still blackened by ancient fires, cave paintings whose meanings we can only guess at, burial sites that speak of care and ritual and beliefs we can never fully know. The land itself is the primary witness to this ancient past. In the arid southwest, cliff dwellings still cling to canyon walls, their stone rooms open to the sky after centuries of abandonment. Across the Mississippi River Valley, massive earthen mounds rise from farm fields, monuments to civilizations that flourished and faded before European ships appeared on the horizon. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the remains of wooden structures slowly decay back into the soil, while along the Atlantic coast, shell middens, accumulations of discarded oyster and clam shells, stand as testimony to thousands of years of harvesting the same productive waters. Each site is a point of connection to lives lived long ago, to decisions made, to adaptations and innovations that allowed human beings to thrive in every corner of this diverse continent. But before there were cliff palaces and burial mounds, before there were villages and territories and the complex tapestry of cultures that existed at the moment of European contact, there were the first arrivals, small bands of people moving through landscapes that had never known human presence, following game trails into an empty wilderness. These earliest Americans left the faintest traces. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists debated when humans first reached the Americas, with estimates ranging from a few thousand years ago to tens of thousands. Each new discovery pushed the timeline deeper, challenged existing theories, sparked controversies that sometimes took decades to resolve. The picture that has emerged is complex and still incomplete, but it speaks to remarkable journeys, to people who crossed from one continent to another during a period when the world itself was different, locked in the grip of an ice age that had lowered sea levels and exposed land bridges, that had covered much of northern North America under glaciers thousands of feet thick. To understand the first Americans, we must imagine a world in transformation. The late Pleistocene epoch, from roughly 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, was a time of dramatic climate fluctuations. Massive ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern latitudes. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet as water locked in glaciers was released and then frozen again. Animal populations shifted with the changing vegetation. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, species now extinct roaming landscapes that would become the heartland of modern nations. Into this Ice Age world came the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, migrants from Asia, who would over thousands of years spread from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, diversifying into hundreds of distinct cultures and languages. The story of these first Americans is written in DNA and stone tools, in the stratigraphy of archaeological sites, and the analysis of ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments. It is a story told by geneticists and linguists, geologists and anthropologists, each discipline contributing pieces to the larger puzzle. But it is also a story that resists simple telling, that remains open to interpretation and revision as new evidence emerges. The storyteller shumanis would tit simpere. Chit bibent frusintit. The search continues, in remote valleys, where no archaeologist has yet ventured, in collections of artifacts gathered decades ago and now being examined with new techniques, in the oral traditions of indigenous communities, whose stories of origin contain their own truths about arrival and belonging. As we begin this journey through the deep past of North America, we do so with humility. The people we are trying to understand left no written records. Their voices come to us only through material remains, and through the stories preserved by their descendants. We can reconstruct aspects of how they lived, what they ate, what tools they made, where they camped and hunted. But their thoughts, their beliefs, the songs they sang and the stories they told around evening fires remain lost to time. What we can do is honor their presence, acknowledge their ingenuity and resilience, and try to understand the remarkable achievement of peopling an entire hemisphere, of adapting to every environment this diverse continent offered, of building lives and cultures that would endure for more than 15,000 years, before being irrevocably transformed by contact with the wider world. The journey begins in ice and cold, in a place that no longer exists, a lost land between two continents, where the story of the Americas truly starts. 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, the world was a colder, drier, more austere version of itself. Ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. In Europe, glaciers reached down to London and Berlin. Sea levels had dropped by more than 300 feet as vast quantities of water became locked in these continental ice masses. And in the North Pacific, this dramatic fall in sea level exposed something remarkable: a land bridge more than 1,000 miles wide connecting the eastern tip of Siberia to Alaska, a cold grassland stretching between two continents that geographers and archaeologists have come to call Beringia. This was not a narrow corridor across which desperate migrants hurried to reach a new world. Beringia was a world unto itself, a vast tundra steppe supporting herds of grazing animals and the predators that followed them. Imagine standing on this lost plain. The horizon extends in every direction, broken only by distant mountain ranges to the north and south. The vegetation is low and hardy: grasses, sedges, sage, dwarf willows, clinging close to the ground. In summer, wildflowers bloom in brief profusion, and clouds of insects rise from temporary wetlands formed by melting snow. In winter, fierce winds scour the landscape, driving snow into drifts and exposing patches of frozen ground where the hardiest plants still grow, providing fodder for mammoths and horses, bison and caribou. The fauna of Beringia was spectacular by any measure. Woolly mammoths moved in herds across the tundra, their thick fur protecting them from temperatures that regularly plunged well below freezing. Steppe bison, larger than their modern descendants, grazed alongside horses and elk. Predators followed the herds. Dire wolves hunted in packs. American lions, larger than modern African lions, stalked the megafauna, and humans, arriving from the west, added their own predatory presence to this ecosystem. The human story of Beringia is one that archaeologists and geneticists have worked for decades to piece together. The evidence suggests that people first entered Beringia from Siberia, part of the broader dispersal of modern humans that had carried our species out of Africa and across Asia over tens of thousands of years. These were people adapted to cold climates, skilled hunters who understood how to survive in harsh environments. They dressed in carefully tailored skin and fur clothing, constructed portable shelters, knew how to make fire even in damp conditions, and possessed sophisticated hunting technology, including spears and atlatls, spear throwers that could propel a projectile with lethal force. Genetic studies of contemporary Native American populations, combined with ancient DNA extracted from rare preserved remains, have revealed fascinating details about these Beringian populations. It appears that a founding group, perhaps numbering only a few thousand individuals, became somewhat isolated in Beringia, remaining there for several thousand years even as ice sheets blocked their passage further east into the Americas. This period of isolation allowed distinct genetic signatures to develop, patterns that can still be detected in indigenous populations throughout the Americas today. When the ice eventually retreated and pathways opened, descendants of this Beringian population began moving southward and eastward, ultimately spreading throughout both North and South America. The landscape of Beringia was not uniform. The western portions closer to Siberia were drier and more open, true steppe dominated by grasses and herbs. The eastern sections, approaching Alaska, received more precipitation and supported shrub tundra, with willow and birch forming dense thickets in protected valleys. Rivers carved through the plain, their valleys providing sheltered camping spots and concentrating game animals. Along these waterways, fish runs would have provided seasonal abundance. Arctic char and whitefish making their way upstream to spawn, offering protein that could be dried and stored against the long winter. Archaeological evidence for human presence in Beringia itself is sparse, but not entirely absent. Heights in eastern Siberia and Alaska have yielded stone tools and the remains of hearths dating back more than 14,000 years. What is clear is that by at least 15,000 years ago, and probably earlier, humans were present in eastern Beringia, the portion that would later become Alaska and the Yukon. These people lived in a world still dominated by Pleistocene megafauna, still locked in glacial cold, still separated from the rest of the Americas by immense barriers of ice. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada, while the Cordilleran ice sheet blanketed the mountain ranges of British Columbia and Alaska. Between these two massive ice formations, pathways would periodically open as the climate fluctuated, creating corridors through which both animals and humans could move southward. One such corridor appears to have opened around 14,000 years ago, running along the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains through what is now Alberta. This ice-free corridor would have been a harsh environment, a narrow passage between walls of ice with lakes of glacial meltwater and sparse vegetation. Yet it provided a route, and evidence suggests that some early peoples took it, moving southward into the Great Plains and beyond. Other researchers have proposed an alternative or complementary route along the Pacific coast, where ice sheets retreated from the shoreline earlier than in the interior, potentially allowing people to move south by boat, hopping from one ice-free refuge to another, harvesting marine resources as they went. The drowning of Beringia began around 13,000 years ago, as global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted, releasing vast quantities of water back into the oceans. Sea levels rose steadily, and the land bridge gradually became submerged. First, shallow seas invaded from both the Pacific and Arctic sides, cutting channels through the plain. Islands appeared, then became fewer and smaller. By roughly 11,000 years ago, the process was complete. Beringia had become the Bering Strait, a narrow waterway separating Asia from America, its grasslands, and the animals that had roamed them now beneath more than 150 feet of cold salt water. The story of Beringia reminds us that the world has not always been as we know it, that landscapes we think of as permanent are in fact transient on the scale of geological time. Entire ecosystems can vanish beneath rising seas. Land connections that allowed migrations can be severed. Those who crossed Beringia had no sense that they were discovering a new world or embarking on a grand migration that would populate two continents. They were simply following game herds, seeking good hunting, finding places where their families could survive and eventually prosper. That their journeys would lead to the peopling of the Americas was an outcome they could not have imagined, but one that would shape human history in profound ways. In the cold waters of the Bering Strait today, the ghosts of mammoths still roam invisible plains beneath the waves. In the summer of 1932, a road grading crew working near the small town of Clovis, New Mexico, unearthed something unexpected: large bones eroding from an arroyo bank, exposed by recent rains and the scraping of heavy machinery. The bones proved to be those of extinct Pleistocene mammals, mammoths and ancient bison. But what made the discovery extraordinary were the artifacts found in direct association with them: beautifully crafted stone spear points, lying among the bones in a way that clearly indicated human involvement in the deaths of these now vanished animals. The Clovis points, as they came to be known, are remarkable objects. Typically 3 to 4 inches long, they are thin, symmetrical, and exquisitely made. Their most distinctive feature is a flute or channel that runs from the base toward the tip on both faces of the point, a groove created by removing a long flake from each side. This fluting would have helped in hafting the point to a wooden spear shaft, creating a secure weapon for hunting large game. The edges are carefully pressure flaked, creating a sharp blade capable of penetrating thick hide. Holding one of these points today, you can still sense the skill of the person who made it, the hours of patient work shaping stone into an elegant and functional tool. The discovery at Clovis, and subsequent finds at other sites across North America, revolutionized understanding of the continent's human past. Prior to the 1930s, there was considerable skepticism in archaeological circles about the antiquity of humans in the Americas. The Clovis discoveries, carefully excavated and documented, provided irrefutable evidence that humans had been present in North America at least 13,000 years ago. At the end of the Pleistocene epoch, when mammoths still roamed the grasslands and giant ground sloths browsed in the forests. As more Clovis sites were discovered, from the Great Plains to the eastern woodlands, from the southwest deserts to the Pacific Northwest, a picture emerged of a people who spread rapidly across the continent. Clovis points, despite regional variations, share enough common features that archaeologists recognize them as part of a unified tradition, suggesting either a single founding population that dispersed quickly or a technology that spread rapidly through existing populations. The dates cluster tightly around 13,000 to 12,800 years ago, a brief window in archaeological terms, followed by regional diversification as populations adapted to local environments and developed distinct traditions. The Clovis culture represents more than just a stone tool technology. These were sophisticated hunters, living in small, mobile bands, following migrating game herds and exploiting seasonal resources. Analysis of Clovis sites has revealed a broad diet, mammoth and mastodon at some locations, but also bison, elk, deer, smaller mammals, and plant foods. These were not specialized mammoth hunters as once thought, but flexible foragers who took whatever the landscape offered. The presence of Clovis points at kill sites, places where animals were butchered, shows that they hunted cooperatively, probably driving prey into favorable positions or ambushing them at water sources. For decades, the Clovis first model dominated North American archaeology. According to this framework, the makers of Clovis points were the first people to enter the Americas, arriving via the ice-free corridor around 13,500 years ago, and then rapidly spreading throughout both continents. The model was elegant and well supported by the archaeological record, as understood at the time. Clovis was the oldest clearly documented culture in the Americas, and the apparent speed of its dispersal matched what one might expect from a founding population moving into landscapes rich with game and free from human competition. But science advances by questioning established models, and even as the Clovis first paradigm held sway, archaeologists continued searching for earlier sites. The challenge was formidable. The older a site, the more likely that evidence has been destroyed by natural processes. Erosion, deposition, glaciation, flooding. Older sites are also harder to recognize because they may contain less distinctive artifacts or be buried beneath many feet of later sediments. Claims of pre-Clovis occupation were made repeatedly throughout the mid-20th century, but most failed to withstand scrutiny. The evidence was ambiguous, the dating uncertain, the association between artifacts and ancient sediments questionable. The gradual erosion of the Clovis first model began not with a single dramatic discovery, but with an accumulation of evidence from multiple sites, each carefully excavated, thoroughly documented, and subjected to rigorous dating methods. One site in particular played a crucial role in overturning Clovis first, Monte Verde, located in southern Chile, nearly 10,000 miles from Alaska. Excavated over many years, Monte Verde produced remarkable evidence of human occupation, dating to 14,500 years ago, clearly older than Clovis. After years of debate and multiple visits by skeptical archaeologists, Monte Verde gained widespread acceptance. Its importance lay not just in its age, but in what it implied. If people had reached southern Chile by 14,500 years ago, they must have entered North America considerably earlier, long before the Clovis culture appeared. The opening of this door, the acceptance that pre-Clovis peoples existed, led to a flood of new research and re-examination of previously controversial sites. The picture that has emerged is one of multiple migrations, varied lifeways, and regional diversity even in these earliest periods. The makers of Clovis points were not the first Americans, but they may have been the most successful, their technology spreading rapidly, and perhaps displacing or absorbing earlier populations. Or perhaps Clovis represents not a population but an idea, a particularly effective hunting technology that was adopted by people already living throughout the continent. The debate continues in the way of science, with new discoveries regularly reported and old assumptions regularly challenged. What remains clear is that the peopling of the Americas was a complex process, extending back at least 15,000 years, and possibly considerably older. The descendants of those earliest arrivals would go on to create the rich tapestry of cultures that existed throughout the Americas. Cultures we are only beginning to understand. Traditions that were thriving long before anyone imagined constructing pyramids in Egypt or raising stone circles in Britain. The acceptance of pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas has opened a new chapter in North American archaeology, one characterized by careful excavation, rigorous dating, and willingness to reconsider long-held assumptions. The sites that have pushed human arrival deeper into the past are scattered across the continent, from Texas to Oregon, from Florida to Chile, each adding pieces to a puzzle that remains incomplete but increasingly coherent. The Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon sit in a landscape of sage and juniper, overlooking ancient lake beds that once held water during the wetter conditions of the late Pleistocene. These shallow rock shelters were used repeatedly by humans over thousands of years, and excavations there have produced some of the most compelling evidence for pre-Clovis occupation. Most significantly, researchers recovered human coprolites, fossilized feces, from sediment layers radiocarbon dated to more than 14,000 years ago. DNA analysis confirmed their human origin, providing direct biological evidence for the presence of people before the Clovis culture emerged. In central Texas, the Buttermilk Creek complex, at the Deborah Creek in site, has produced an enormous assemblage of stone tools, from stratigraphic layers beneath those containing Clovis points. More than 15,000 artifacts were recovered, including flakes, blades, and simple cutting tools. The pre-Clovis levels have been dated to between 15,500 and 13,200 years ago, making them among the oldest definitively human deposits in North America. The stoneworking tradition documented here is different from Clovis. The tools are generally simpler, without the distinctive fluting and careful symmetry of classic Clovis points. This suggests that multiple technological traditions existed before Clovis appeared, raising questions about the relationships between these earlier peoples and the later Clovis culture. On the Channel Islands off California's coast, Arlington Springs Pleistocene remains dated to 13,000 years ago, provides evidence that people possessed watercraft capable of crossing ocean channels, even at this early date. The islands were never connected to the mainland, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, meaning that anyone who reached them had to cross at least several miles of open water. This discovery supports the coastal migration hypothesis, the idea that early peoples moved south from Beringia along the Pacific shoreline, using boats to navigate between ice-free refuges and harvesting marine resources as they went. The implications of these pre-Clovis sites are profound. They suggest that the peopling of the Americas was not a single wave of migration, but a complex process involving multiple movements of people, possibly using different routes and bringing different technologies and traditions. Some may have traveled through the interior ice-free corridor once it opened around 14,000 years ago. Others may have followed the coast, their sites now largely drowned by rising seas that have submerged the Pleistocene shoreline under hundreds of feet of water. Still others might have arrived even earlier, during brief intervals when climate conditions allowed movement before the last glacial maximum. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, and this sparseness is not surprising. These earliest populations were small. Genetic estimates suggest the founding groups that eventually populated all of the Americas may have numbered only a few thousand individuals. Small populations leave few traces, and mobile hunter-gatherers who lived in perishable shelters and made simple tools from stone and wood created archaeological signatures that are difficult to detect and easy to miss. Add to this the effects of 15,000 years of natural processes, erosion, deposition, glaciation, flooding, and it becomes clear why pre-Clovis sites remain rare. One of the most intriguing aspects of pre-Clovis research is the question of megafaunal extinction. North America at the end of the Pleistocene was home to a spectacular array of large mammals, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, enormous short-faced bears, and many others. By roughly 10,000 years ago, most of these species were extinct. The timing coincides roughly with the spread of human populations across the continent, leading to debates about whether human hunting played a role in these extinctions, whether climate change was the primary driver, or whether some combination of factors was responsible. Current thinking tends toward a more nuanced view. Humans may have contributed to some extinctions, particularly of the largest herbivores like mammoths and mastodons, while climate change and habitat loss played larger roles in the disappearance of other species. What is clear is that the people who entered the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene witnessed and experienced these dramatic ecological changes. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, the landscape transformed. The megafauna that had dominated for millennia vanished. Vegetation patterns shifted as the climate warmed and ice sheets retreated. The people who lived through these changes adapted as well, developing new technologies and strategies appropriate to the new environments they inhabited. The pre-Clovis period remains one of the most mysterious in North American prehistory. Much has been learned in recent decades, but much remains unknown. The shadows are gradually becoming clearer, the timeline pushing deeper, but the first Americans remain elusive, their lives and journeys still largely a matter of inference and educated speculation. What we can say with certainty is that they were here, moving through landscapes we can barely imagine, adapting and surviving, and ultimately thriving, laying the foundations for all the cultures that would follow. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, from the Ice Age to our current geological epoch, brought transformations that reshaped North America. Between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, average temperatures rose, glaciers retreated northward, and sea levels climbed as meltwater poured back into the oceans. The massive ice sheets that had covered Canada began their long disappearance, revealing landscapes scraped clean by millennia of glacial movement. In their wake came forests, first spruce and pine in the northern latitudes, then deciduous trees moving up from southern refugia, where they had persisted during the coldest periods. For the human inhabitants of North America, these environmental changes required adaptation. The megafauna that had provided abundant meat were gone or disappearing. Mammoths and mastodons vanished entirely. The people who had specialized in hunting these large animals had to adjust their strategies, broaden their diets, develop new technologies appropriate to the changing circumstances. The period that archaeologists call the Archaic, stretching from roughly 8000 BCE to 1000 BCE, represents this long process of adaptation and diversification. The early archaic peoples were still mobile hunter-gatherers, but they were beginning to settle more firmly into regional territories, developing intimate knowledge of local resources and seasonal patterns. In the eastern woodlands, the spread of deciduous forests created new opportunities. Oak, hickory, beech, and chestnut trees produced abundant nuts that could be collected in autumn, processed, and stored to provide calories through the lean winter months. Excavations at archaic sites regularly uncover pits filled with the charred remains of hickory nuts and acorns, evidence of fires used to roast nuts and make them easier to crack. The rivers and streams of the eastern woodlands teemed with life. Migratory fish, alewives, shad, sturgeon made seasonal runs upstream to spawn, providing predictable abundances that people learned to exploit. Along the coast and up tidal rivers, oysters and clams formed vast beds that could be harvested year-round. The shell middens that accumulated at repeatedly occupied sites grew into massive mounds over millennia, some reaching heights of 20 feet or more, formed entirely from discarded shells mixed with charcoal, animal bones, and broken tools. In the southeast, the warming climate and abundant rainfall created diverse wetland environments. Archaic peoples here developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting aquatic resources. Fish weirs, wooden structures built across streams to trap fish, date back to the Middle Archaic period, showing engineering knowledge and cooperative labor. And by the late Archaic, there is evidence of plant cultivation, people encouraging the growth of useful species like sunflowers, squash, and various seed-bearing plants, beginning the long process that would eventually lead to agriculture. The Great Basin posed different challenges. This was and remains a harsh environment, hot in summer, cold in winter, dry throughout the year. Yet archaic peoples not only survived here, but developed rich cultural traditions adapted to desert life. The key was mobility and detailed knowledge of where resources could be found and when they would be available. Pinyon pine nuts ripen in autumn in the mountains, providing concentrated nutrition. Various seed-bearing grasses in the valleys could be harvested in summer. Rabbits and other small game provided protein. The archaeological sites of the Great Basin often preserve remarkably well due to the dry climate. Caves and rock shelters contain materials that would decay elsewhere. Sandals woven from plant fibers or baskets so tightly made they could hold water. Fragments of rabbit skin blankets, wooden atlatls, still showing the finger grips worn smooth by use. These sites give us rare glimpses into the full range of material culture, not just the stone tools that usually survive, but the perishable items that made up most of a hunter-gatherer's toolkit. On the Great Plains, archaic peoples followed bison herds that by this period had recovered from their Pleistocene collapse and adapted to the grassland environment. The hunting strategy that would become famous in later periods was already developing communal drives in which herds were stampeded over cliffs or into corrals, providing large quantities of meat that could be dried and stored. The head-smashed-in buffalo jump in Alberta, used for nearly 6,000 years, shows the sophistication of these operations. Along the Pacific coast, archaic peoples exploited one of the richest resource bases anywhere in North America. Salmon made their annual migrations up coastal rivers in runs so abundant that early European explorers described rivers choked with fish. Shellfish could be harvested from rocky shores. Marine mammals provided meat and blubber and skins. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated maritime adaptations, harpoons for hunting sea mammals, fishhooks made from bone or shell, the development of watercraft capable of ocean voyaging. The technological innovations of the Archaic period reflect these diverse adaptations. Ground stone tools became common. Axes for woodworking, mortars and pestles for grinding seeds and nuts, atlatl weights to increase spear-throwing power. Basketry reached high levels of sophistication. The atlatl or spear thrower was refined and became the primary hunting weapon throughout most of North America. Evidence for long-distance trade networks appears during the Archaic. exotic materials show up far from their sources. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast found in sites in the Midwest, native copper from the Lake Superior region, traded throughout the eastern woodlands, obsidian from volcanic sources in the Rockies, appearing in plains sites. These exchanges may have occurred through down-the-line trade, items passing from one group to another over long distances, or through seasonal gatherings, where multiple bands came together for ceremonies, marriages, and exchange of goods and information. The late Archaic period saw important cultural developments that would lay groundwork for later transformations. In the eastern woodlands, people began creating monumental earthworks, low mounds, and circular embankments that served ceremonial or mortuary functions. The earliest of these, at sites like Watson Break in Louisiana, date to around 3500 BCE, making them older than the pyramids of Egypt. Burial practices during the Archaic became increasingly elaborate. Earlier peoples had generally buried their dead simply. Archaic burials, especially in the late Archaic, show more investment of labor and resources. Some individuals were buried with remarkable accumulations of material goods, copper ornaments, carefully made stone tools, shell beads, sheets of mica. These rich burials suggest emerging social hierarchies, with some individuals or families having access to more resources or enjoying higher status than others. The Archaic period represents the longest continuous cultural period in North American prehistory, a span of some 7,000 years, during which people adapted to every environment the continent offered, developed sophisticated technologies appropriate to their circumstances, and laid the cultural foundations on which later societies would build. By the end of the Archaic period, around 1000 BCE, the stage was set for new developments. In some regions, people were beginning to cultivate plants more intensively. Population densities were increasing in favorable areas, and with larger populations came new forms of social organization, new cultural practices, new ways of relating to the land and to one another. There are mounds rising from the flat farmlands of the Midwest, earthen pyramids and geometric earthworks that speak of ambition and collective effort, of societies more complex than the simple hunter-gatherer bands usually associated with pre-agricultural peoples. These monuments, built without metal tools or beasts of burden, represent thousands of hours of human labor. Earth carried one basketful at a time, designs laid out with careful precision. The mound-building tradition of eastern North America stretches back more than 5,000 years. The earliest monumental earthworks in North America are found in Louisiana. Poverty Point, located near the Mississippi River, remains one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Americas. Built between 1700 and 1100 BCE, Poverty Point consists of massive earthworks arranged in geometric patterns that can only fully be appreciated from the air. The main complex comprises 6 concentric semicircular ridges, each separated by a corridor roughly 100 feet wide. The ridges themselves stand 15 to 20 feet high in places. To the west of the ridges stands Mound A, a massive bird-shaped effigy mound rising 70 feet above the surrounding terrain. Who are the people who built Poverty Point? Archaeological evidence suggests they were hunter-gatherers, not agriculturalists. Their diet consisted of fish, waterfowl, deer, nuts, and seeds, with no sign of domesticated crops. Yet the scale of construction and the presence of exotic trade goods from across eastern North America indicate a level of social organization usually associated with agricultural societies. Raw materials and finished goods at Poverty Point include copper from Lake Superior, hematite from the Ozarks, soapstone from the Appalachians. Stone tools show remarkable craftsmanship. The culture that created Poverty Point flourished for several centuries, then faded. But the tradition of earthwork construction did not disappear. After a gap of several hundred years, new mound-building cultures emerged in the Ohio River Valley and surrounding regions. The Adena culture, dating from roughly 1000 BCE to 200 BCE, created burial mounds throughout the Ohio Valley. These are typically conical earthen mounds, ranging from a few feet to 60 or more feet in height, often containing log-lined tombs in which the dead were laid with burial goods. The most impressive Adena mound is the Great Serpent Mound in southern Ohio, an effigy earthwork nearly a quarter-mile long, depicting a serpent whose undulating body follows the contours of a plateau. The Adena were succeeded and partially overlapped by the Hopewell culture, sometimes called the Hopewell interaction sphere, because it represents more a shared tradition and trade network than a single unified culture. The Hopewell period, from roughly 200 BCE to 500 CE, marks the florescence of mound building in eastern North America. Hopewell earthworks are found throughout the Midwest, but the most spectacular concentrations are in southern Ohio, where geometric earthworks of astonishing precision were constructed. At Newark, Ohio, the Hopewell built a complex that originally covered more than 4 square miles. What remains includes the Great Circle, a perfect circular embankment 1,200 feet in diameter, enclosing more than 30 acres. Nearby stands the Octagon earthworks, 8 walls forming a nearly perfect octagon, each wall more than 550 feet long. The precision of these constructions is remarkable. Surveys have shown that the angles and measurements are accurate to within inches over hundreds of feet. The earthworks were not isolated monuments, but parts of integrated ceremonial landscapes. They were connected by long, straight pathways, raised earthen roads that ran for miles across the countryside. The labor required to construct these features was immense. At the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park in Ohio, archaeologists have calculated that the earthworks there required moving more than 3 million cubic feet of earth. Hopewell burial mounds contained remarkable offerings. Hopper had been worked into elaborate ear spools and breastplates. Harmaker from the Appalachians was cut into intricate shapes. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains was knapped into ceremonial blades. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico were carved into gorgets and cups. Carved stone pipes, often depicting animals with remarkable anatomical accuracy, show artistic skill of the highest order. Many earthworks are aligned to solar and lunar events: sunrise on the summer solstice, moonrise at the major lunar standstill. This suggests sophisticated astronomical observation and beliefs that connected earthly ceremonies to celestial phenomena. The Hopewell tradition began to decline around 400 CE, and by 500 CE, the construction of elaborate earthworks and the long-distance trade in exotic goods had largely ceased. The reasons remain debated: climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval. Whatever the cause, the mound-building tradition persisted in other regions, particularly in the southeast, where it would ultimately reach its greatest elaboration. The mounds that still stand today are monuments to cultures whose names we do not know. The people who built them left no writing, and by the time Europeans arrived in eastern North America, the great earthwork centers had been abandoned for centuries. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that systematic archaeology began to establish the truth. The mounds were built by indigenous North Americans over a span of thousands of years, representing a tradition of monumental construction as old as anything in the Old World. In the floodplain of the Mississippi River, just across from where St. Louis sprawls today, there rises from the flat bottomlands an earthen pyramid, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Monk's Mound stands 100 feet tall, its terraced levels covering 14 acres. From the top, the view extends for miles across the American bottom, that fertile floodplain that attracted human settlement for thousands of years, but never saw anything like what appeared here around 1050 CE. This was Cahokia, and in its prime between 1050 and 1200 CE, it was the largest settlement in North America, north of Mexico, a city of perhaps 15 to 20,000 people at its peak. To put this in perspective, Cahokia was larger than London during the same period. Yet Cahokia has left no written records, and by the time European explorers pushed up the Mississippi in the 1540s, it had been abandoned for more than a century. The ruins of Cahokia extend for 6 square miles. What remains is still impressive: more than 70 earthen mounds of various sizes, the largest being Monk's Mound at the center. To the west of Monk's Mound spreads the Grand Plaza, a carefully leveled area of 50 acres, where thousands could gather for ceremonies, games, or markets. Around the plaza, and extending outward, once stood thousands of rectangular structures with walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, and central hearths. Archaeological excavations at Cahokia have revealed much about how this metropolis functioned. The city was organized into distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character. Some areas were clearly residential, others were specialized craft production zones. One neighborhood devoted to working shell into beads, another focused on creating ceremonial objects from copper. The scale of production suggests specialists, people who made their living through craft work rather than farming. The raising of Monk's Mound speaks to organizational capacity of a high order. The construction occurred in multiple episodes, over about 250 years. The final form comprises 4 terraces, each rising above the one below, the uppermost large enough to support a substantial building. The positioning of the mound aligned with other architectural features, creating sightlines and symbolic connections. Surrounding Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza was a massive palisade, a defensive wall built of logs with bastions positioned at regular intervals. The palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times, suggesting that defense was a persistent concern. This evidence of fortification, combined with skeletal remains showing violent deaths and with mass burials that may represent sacrificial victims, suggests that Cahokia was not a peaceful society. One of the most intriguing features at Cahokia is a series of large circles marked by massive cedar posts, what archaeologists call wood henges. These were constructed at different times, each consisting of posts arranged in a circle with one post at the center. The posts were precisely positioned to mark astronomical events, sunrise on the equinoxes and solstices. The effort required to transport and erect posts weighing several tons each demonstrates both engineering skill and the importance placed on astronomical observation. The economy of Cahokia was based on intensive maize agriculture. The floodplain soils were rich and productive. Maize supplemented with beans and squash could support dense populations if farming was intensive enough. The surplus produced by farmers in the countryside flowed into the city, supporting not just the population living there, but also allowing some people to specialize in non-food producing activities. Cahokia was the center of a cultural and political sphere of influence that extended hundreds of miles. Throughout the Midwest and Southeast, smaller mound centers appeared during Cahokia's florescence, many showing architectural styles and artifacts similar to those at Cahokia. A distinctive style of pottery, types of stone tools, architectural patterns, and ceremonial objects spread from Cahokia outward, creating what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture. Religion and ideology played crucial roles in maintaining Cahokia's power. The city was clearly a ceremonial center, as well as an economic and political capital. Artifacts include elaborate symbolic objects, copper plates embossed with images of birdmen and warriors, shell goggets carved with intricate designs. The most dramatic evidence of ritual activity comes from Mound 72, which contained multiple burials, including a high-status individual laid on a platform of thousands of shell beads, accompanied by hundreds of projectile points and other offerings. Nearby were mass burials, young women interred together in ways suggesting sacrifice. Cahokia reached its peak around 1200 CE, after which population began to decline. By 1350, the city was largely abandoned. The causes of this collapse remain debated. Environmental degradation may have played a role. Deforestation could have led to erosion. Climate change is another possibility. Tree ring records show extended droughts. Social factors may have been important too. Or perhaps it was a combination of factors that ultimately made Cahokia unsustainable. Today, Monk's Mound and the other surviving earthworks at Cahokia are preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors can climb to the summit and look out over the landscape, much as Cahokia's elite once did. Cahokia stands as a reminder that complexity, urbanization, and monumental architecture arose independently in the Americas, that Native American societies achieved sophistication equal to ancient civilizations elsewhere in the world. The landscape of the American Southwest speaks of extremes, vast deserts where summer temperatures exceed 100 degrees, mesas rising abruptly from valley floors, canyons carved through stone by rivers that run dry for much of the year. This is an environment that seems hostile to human habitation, yet people have lived here continuously for more than 12,000 years, and at various times they created some of the most remarkable architecture in ancient North America. The Southwest Culture Area extends across present-day Arizona, New Mexico, southern Utah, and Colorado, and portions of northern Mexico. Within this broad region, several distinct cultural traditions emerged, each adapted to particular environmental conditions. The 3 major traditions, ancestral Puebloan, Hokum, and Mogollon, overlapped chronologically and geographically, traded with one another, yet remained distinct. The ancestral Puebloan culture developed on the Colorado Plateau, the high desert country of the Four Corners region. The earliest ancestral Puebloans, appearing around 100 BCE, lived in small settlements, built pit houses partially below ground for insulation, and practiced a mixed economy of farming, hunting, and gathering. They grew corn, introduced from Mesoamerica centuries earlier, supplemented with wild plants and game. Over the following centuries, ancestral Puebloan culture became increasingly sophisticated. By 700 CE, people were building above-ground structures with stone foundations. Pottery styles diversified. Population increased as farming became more productive. They built check dams in arroyos to slow runoff, terraced hillsides to create level planting surfaces, and in some areas constructed reservoirs to store water. The florescence occurred between 900 and 1300 CE. This was when the great houses of Chaco Canyon were built, when cliff dwellings were constructed at Mesa Verde. Chaco Canyon, in northwestern New Mexico, became the center of a regional system that extended across tens of thousands of square miles. The great houses of Chaco, Pueblo Bonito, Chetro Kettle, Pueblo Alto, are massive stone buildings, some containing more than 600 rooms, arranged in carefully planned D-shaped layouts. The walls are constructed of precisely shaped sandstone blocks, rising in some places to 4 stories. Interior rooms were roofed with logs, transported from mountain forests 40 miles away. The architecture of Chaco speaks to planning and social organization on a scale unusual for societies without metal tools. Pueblo Bonito alone required approximately 200,000 trees. The stonework shows sophisticated masonry techniques. Kivas, circular subterranean ceremonial chambers, are incorporated into the great houses, some of them enormous. Chaco was connected to outlying communities by a network of roads, engineered features 30 feet wide that run perfectly straight for miles. Where the roads encounter cliffs, stairs were carved into the rock. The purpose of these roads remains debated. They seem far too wide for simple foot traffic, leading some archaeologists to propose ceremonial functions. The environment of Chaco Canyon is harsh, too dry and cold for reliable agriculture. Yet at its peak, Chaco may have housed several thousand people. How was this population sustained? Archaeological evidence points to a complex exchange system, with food and resources flowing into Chaco from surrounding areas, perhaps as tribute to support ritual activities. Turquoise was worked at Chaco in enormous quantities. Macaw feathers and copper bells from Mesoamerica appear in Chaco contexts, evidence of long-distance trade. The Chaco system collapsed in the mid-1100s, not through violent destruction, but through gradual abandonment. A severe drought beginning around 1130 CE stressed agricultural production. Tree ring evidence suggests that firewood became increasingly scarce. People began leaving Chaco, moving to areas with more reliable water. The next chapter unfolded at Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, where people built spectacular cliff dwellings. Mesa Verde is a high plateau cut by deep canyons, its canyon walls honeycombed with alcoves formed by erosion. During the 1200s, as the Chaco system was collapsing, population in the Mesa Verde region increased. Between 1190 and 1260, many communities relocated to alcoves in the canyon walls, constructing multi-story stone pueblos in naturally sheltered spaces. Cliff Palace, the largest of these cliff dwellings, contains more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas, built into an alcove 325 feet long. The masonry is expertly crafted, with walls rising 3 and 4 stories. The placement takes advantage of the alcove's protection. Winter sun reaches deep into the space, while summer sun is blocked by the overhanging cliff. Water sources were located at the base of the cliffs, requiring residents to descend by hand and toe holds cut into rock. Life in the cliff dwellings was never easy. Water had to be carried up from springs. All food and firewood had to be hauled up difficult trails. Analysis of skeletal remains shows evidence of nutritional stress. By 1300, Mesa Verde and most of the Four Corners region was abandoned, part of a broader migration that saw ancestral Puebloan populations moving south and east, eventually becoming ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples. While the ancestral Puebloans dominated the Colorado Plateau, a different tradition flourished in the deserts of southern Arizona. The Hokum culture, emerging around 300 CE, adapted to the Sonoran Desert through construction of extensive canal systems. The Salt River and Gila River provided water sources, but these desert streams flow irregularly. The Hokum engineered canals to divert water, distributing it across alluvial plains. The canal systems of the Phoenix Basin are among the most impressive pre-Columbian engineering works in North America. At their maximum extent around 1300 CE, more than 500 miles of canals crisscrossed the valley, some more than 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The canals were laid out with sophisticated understanding of gradient. The Hokum achieved gradients of just 1 to 2 feet per mile, precisely engineered to maintain flow without causing damage. These canal systems required communal labor for construction and maintenance. Hearths. This necessity for cooperation likely drove development of complex social organization, with leaders coordinating work parties and resolving disputes. The canals made possible intensive agriculture in one of North America's driest regions, supporting villages scattered across the desert. Hokum material culture shows strong influences from Mesoamerica. They built ball courts similar to those found throughout Mexico. Platform mounds appear at major sites. The Hokum practiced cremation, placing ashes in ceramic vessels. Trade connected the Hokum to distant regions. Marine shells from the Gulf of California were worked into jewelry. Copper bells and macaw feathers found their way to Hokum sites. The Hokum tradition ended around 1450 CE, not with dramatic collapse, but with transformation. The canal systems were abandoned, large villages dispersed. What caused this change remains unclear. Perhaps drought, perhaps salinization of fields, perhaps social upheaval. The modern O'odham peoples of southern Arizona likely include descendants of the Hokum among their ancestors. The Southwest during the centuries before European contact was a mosaic of cultures, all adapted to the challenges of life in an arid land. The achievements of these ancient peoples in architecture, engineering, art, and social organization reflect profound understanding of their environment and remarkable ingenuity in creating sustainable ways of life. The ruins they left behind remain as testimony to human resilience and the capacity to flourish even in the most challenging landscapes. The Arctic is a place of extremes, where winter darkness lasts for months and summer sun never sets, where temperatures plunge to 60 below zero and ice covers the ocean for much of the year. Yet people have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, developing technologies and strategies so sophisticated that they not only survived but thrived. The story of human adaptation to the Arctic is one of ingenuity, careful observation of nature, and intimate knowledge passed from generation to generation. The prehistory of the North American Arctic is complex, with multiple migrations and cultural traditions appearing over millennia. The earliest well-documented Arctic tradition is the Arctic small tool tradition, appearing around 2500 BCE. These people moved eastward from Alaska across the Canadian Arctic, reaching Greenland by 2400 BCE. They were primarily caribou hunters, following seasonal migrations, though they also hunted seals and birds. Their toolkit was miniaturized, tiny stone blades, hafted into bone handles, and efficient use of scarce materials. Around 800 BCE, a new cultural tradition appeared, the Dorset culture, named after Cape Dorset on Baffin Island. The Dorset people dominated the eastern Arctic for nearly 2,000 years. They were specialized Arctic hunters, taking seals at breathing holes in the sea ice during winter, a hunting technique requiring patience and skill. A hunter might wait motionless for hours at a breathing hole, harpoon ready, listening for a seal surfacing to breathe in the darkness beneath the ice. Dorset hunters lacked some technologies that would seem essential for Arctic life. They apparently did not use the bow and arrow, they did not have dog sleds, they did not use kayaks or umiaks, the skin boats that would later become synonymous with Arctic maritime hunting. Yet despite these apparent limitations, the Dorset people flourished, developing their own distinctive material culture and artistic traditions. Dorset art is haunting and powerful. They carved small figurines from ivory, bone, and antler, bears, birds, human faces with strangely serene expressions, shamanic figures with skeletal features. Some carvings show deliberate ambiguity, faces that seem human from one angle and animal from another, perhaps representing transformation beliefs common in Arctic shamanism. Around 1000 CE, a new people arrived, the Thule, ancestors of modern Inuit peoples, migrating eastward from the Bering Strait region. They brought technologies that revolutionized Arctic life. The Thule had sophisticated watercraft, single-person kayaks for hunting seals and walrus, and large umiaks for carrying families or hunting bowhead whales. They had dog sleds for winter travel. They had the bow and arrow, and crucially, they had the toggle harpoon, a technological innovation that allowed hunters to take large sea mammals. The toggle harpoon represents a pinnacle of hunting technology. Harpoon head is designed to turn sideways once it penetrates a seal or whale, lodging in the tissue. Attached to the harpoon is a line, and to the line an inflated sealskin float that prevents a wounded animal from diving. With this technology, Thule hunters could pursue whales, bowhead whales in particular, massive animals that could provide tons of meat and blubber. The ability to successfully hunt whales had profound impacts, allowing larger, more sedentary settlements. Thule winter houses were substantial structures. The walls were built of stone and turf, sometimes with whale bones incorporated for structural support, ribs and jawbones serving as rafters. Roofs were constructed of driftwood or whale bones covered with skins and turf, creating well-insulated shelters. Inside, sleeping platforms were covered with furs. Seal oil lamps provided light and heat throughout the dark winter months. Summer was a time of movement. Families left their winter houses and traveled in small bands, hunting caribou inland, fishing for Arctic char, collecting birds' eggs, harvesting berries during the brief growing season. This seasonal round required intimate knowledge of the landscape, where game would be at different times, where the fishing was good, which migration routes offered the best hunting. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed down through stories and practical instruction. Clothing in the Arctic had to provide protection from extreme cold, while allowing ventilation to prevent dangerous sweating. Tutu clothing was masterfully designed. Parkas were made from caribou hide, with the fur facing inward for insulation, often double-layered. Pants, boots, and mittens were similarly constructed, with seams carefully sewn to prevent heat loss. The stitching itself was an art. Women used sinew thread to create tiny stitches that made garments waterproof and windproof. The arrival of the Shuli in regions previously occupied by Dorset people led to the disappearance of Dorset culture, though how this occurred remains debated. The Shuli expansion occurred during the medieval warm period, when temperatures were somewhat higher. This warming may have extended the range of bowhead whales, drawing Shuli hunters into new territories. By 1200 CE, Shuli people had spread throughout the Canadian Arctic and reached Greenland. Climate deteriorated beginning around 1300 CE, ushering in the Little Ice Age. Sea ice became more extensive, whale populations shifted, and Arctic peoples had to adapt their strategies. In some regions, large permanent villages were abandoned in favor of smaller, more mobile groups. These adaptations demonstrate flexibility and resilience, the capacity to adjust as conditions changed. When European explorers began probing the Arctic in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered Inuit peoples, descended from the Thule tradition, living much as their ancestors had lived for centuries. The Europeans were often dependent on Inuit knowledge for survival, learning how to build snow houses, how to dress for extreme cold, how to hunt seals. Many early Arctic expeditions would have ended in disaster without assistance from Inuit guides who possessed expertise accumulated over thousands of years. The Arctic remains one of the most challenging environments humans inhabit, and the indigenous peoples of the North maintain cultural connections to the ancient traditions developed by their ancestors. Modern life has changed much, but traditional knowledge is still valued and practiced, passed from elders to youth, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated over millennia of Arctic survival continues into the future. The Pacific coast of North America, stretching from the Alaska Panhandle to Southern California, is a landscape defined by the meeting of land and sea. Temperate rainforests cascade down steep slopes to rocky shores, where waves break with thunder. Rivers carve through valleys, their estuaries forming protected bays. This is one of the most productive environments anywhere on Earth, and the indigenous peoples who lived here developed cultures of remarkable sophistication. The Northwest Coast culture area extends from southeastern Alaska through British Columbia and down to northern California. The dominant feature is abundance. Salmon runs so prolific that early European explorers described rivers choked with fish, seals, and sea lions by the thousands, whales migrating in predictable patterns, shellfish beds that could feed communities for generations. The forest provided cedar trees massive enough that a single trunk could yield planks for multiple houses, or be carved into ocean-going canoes. This abundance supported dense populations living in permanent villages, creating complex social hierarchies and elaborate artistic traditions. Salmon were the foundation of Northwest Coast economies. 5 species of Pacific salmon return from the ocean to spawn in freshwater streams, each species with slightly different timing. For indigenous peoples, this meant multiple harvests spread throughout summer and fall. The size of the runs was staggering. Millions of fish returning to spawn, swimming upstream in such numbers that their bodies were pressed against one another. Harvesting salmon required technology and organization. At narrow points in rivers, people built weirs, fences of stakes that funneled fish into traps. At waterfalls and rapids, platforms were built, extending over the water, allowing fishermen to use dip nets or spears. Women processed the catch, splitting salmon and hanging them on racks to dry, creating preserved food that would last through winter. A successful salmon run could provide a year's food supply in a few weeks of intensive work. The availability of abundant, storable food freed people from constant search for subsistence and allowed specialization. Some individuals became master canoe builders. Others specialized in weaving cedar bark into clothing and baskets, in carving wooden masks and totem poles, in working copper. This specialization produced artistic traditions of great sophistication. Northwest Coast art is immediately recognizable, formline designs with flowing lines, representations of animals with characteristic conventions, transformation imagery showing beings simultaneously human and animal. Totem poles, perhaps the most iconic feature, served multiple functions. Some were heraldic, displaying the crests and lineages of important families. Others were memorial poles, honoring deceased chiefs. Still others were mortuary poles, containing the remains of the deceased. The poles were carved from massive cedar logs, painted in black, red, white, and sometimes blue-green, depicting stacked figures, ravens, eagles, bears, wolves, killer whales, supernatural beings, ancestors. Social organization on the northwest coast was hierarchical. At the top were chiefs and nobles, families with hereditary rights to resource sites. Below them were commoners. At the bottom were slaves, individuals captured in warfare or born into slavery. This stratification was unusual for hunter-gatherer societies, but the productivity of the environment made it possible. The potlatch ceremony institutionalized and reinforced this hierarchy. A potlatch was a feast given by a chief to mark important occasions. Guests from near and far were invited, sometimes hundreds of people, who were feasted and entertained for days. The host distributed gifts, woven blankets, copper plaques, carved boxes, canoes, and the value of the gifts reflected on the host's status. To receive a gift created an obligation to reciprocate at a future potlatch, and chiefs competed to outdo one another in generosity. Cedar was central to northwest coast cultures. Western red cedar provided wood for houses, massive planks split from standing trees using wooden wedges. These planks formed the walls and roofs of longhouses, communal dwellings that could house multiple related families. The largest longhouses were more than 100 feet long and 40 feet wide. Cedar bark had countless uses. Shredded cedar bark was woven into clothing, capes and skirts with a distinctive shaggy texture that shed water. Woven more tightly, cedar bark made baskets so closely twined they could hold water. Cedar roots were used to sew together canoe planks. Even the inner bark was processed to create soft fibers for bedding. The ocean provided as much as the rivers. Humor and mammals, seals, sea lions, porpoises, and whales were hunted from large cedar dugout canoes. Whale hunting, practiced particularly by the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples of western Vancouver Island, was dangerous and required great skill. Crews paddled ocean-going canoes up to 40 feet long, pursuing grey whales during their migrations. The harpoon man stood at the bow, waiting for the right moment, then drove a mussel shell-tipped harpoon deep into the whale. Inflated sealskin floats tired the wounded whale, and additional harpoons were added as the chase continued. When the whale finally died, it was towed back to shore, a single whale providing tons of meat and blubber. Further south, in California, the environment became drier, but remained productive. The California culture area extended from the Oregon border to Baja California, encompassing extraordinary environmental diversity. This diversity supported equally diverse cultures. Archaeologists estimate that at European contact, California was home to more than 300,000 people speaking more than 100 distinct languages. Acorns were the staple food for most California groups. Several oak species produce abundant acorns in fall. Acorns require processing. They contain bitter tannins that must be leached out. Women developed elaborate techniques for leaching, using woven baskets or sand basins, pouring warm water repeatedly through acorn flour until the tannins were removed. Acorn mush, cooked by dropping hot stones into tightly woven baskets, was a dietary staple, supplemented with seeds, roots, fish, and game. The Chumash peoples of the Southern California coast were maritime specialists, building unique plank canoes called tamols. Unlike dugout canoes typical elsewhere, tamols were constructed from separate planks, sewn together with plant fiber cordage, and sealed with asphaltum. These craft were seaworthy enough to make the crossing to the Channel Islands, 20 miles offshore. California basketry reached extraordinary levels of refinement. Women wove baskets in coiled and twined techniques, using materials gathered seasonally. Designs incorporated feathers, beads, and shells. The finest baskets had such tight weaves that individual stitches could barely be distinguished, and they were so valuable that they were treasured as heirlooms. The diversity of Pacific coast cultures reflects the diversity of environments they inhabited, from the salmon fishers of the northern rivers to the acorn gatherers of California oak woodlands, from the whale hunters of Vancouver Island to the shellfish collectors of rocky shores. Each group developed strategies perfectly adapted to local conditions. This adaptation was refined over thousands of years through observation and accumulation of knowledge. The result was a mosaic of cultures living successfully in one of the richest regions of North America, creating sophisticated societies that flourished without agriculture. The Great Plains stretch across the heart of North America, a vast grassland extending from the Rocky Mountains eastward to the Mississippi River Valley. It is a landscape of immense skies and distant horizons, where thunderstorms build into towering columns, where wind moves through grass in waves like an ocean. For thousands of years, this grassland was home to enormous herds of bison, American buffalo, whose populations numbered in the tens of millions. The relationship between indigenous peoples and the buffalo defined life on the Great Plains. Buffalo provided almost everything needed for survival: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread. A single buffalo could provide 400 pounds of meat, and successful hunts might take dozens or even hundreds of animals, creating abundance that could be preserved through drying, sustaining communities through lean seasons. The challenge for pre-horse plains peoples was how to hunt these large, dangerous animals effectively without being able to run them down. The solution was communal hunting, elaborate operations requiring cooperation and detailed knowledge of buffalo behavior. The most dramatic technique was the buffalo jump, driving entire herds over cliffs where they fell to their deaths or were injured badly enough that hunters waiting below could finish them. Buffalo jumps were used repeatedly over centuries, sometimes over millennia, becoming sacred places marked by enormous accumulations of bones at the base of cliffs. Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in southern Alberta is perhaps the most famous of these sites. The location was chosen with care, a natural basin in the prairie where buffalo gathered, with a sandstone cliff at one edge rising 40 feet. The operation required extensive preparation. Days or even weeks before the actual drive, scouts located herds and monitored their movements. Lines of stone cairns were built extending back from the cliff edge for miles, forming a V-shape that would funnel buffalo toward the precipice. On the day of the hunt, runners positioned themselves behind the herd, showing themselves briefly to startle the animals into flight. Other people positioned themselves along the drive lanes, showing themselves at critical moments to keep the herd moving in the right direction. Once the buffalo began running, their own herd instincts took over. Animals at the front, seeing the cliff too late to stop, were pushed over by those behind. The scene below the cliff was one of organized chaos. Hunters moved among the fallen animals, killing those still alive, beginning the enormous task of butchering. Women and children joined in the work, which might continue for days. Everything was used. Meat was cut into strips and hung on racks to dry. Hides were pegged out to cure. Bones were cracked to extract marrow. The scale of processing was immense. One estimate suggests that a drive yielding 100 buffalo would produce 40,000 pounds of meat, enough to feed 50 people for a year if properly preserved. Other hunting techniques were also employed. Surrounds involved multiple hunters, forming a circle around a portion of a herd, gradually tightening the circle while shooting arrows. Impoundments used natural features or constructed corrals to trap buffalo. In winter, hunters on snowshoes could pursue buffalo through deep snow where the heavy animals floundered. Before the arrival of horses in the late 17th century, Great Plains peoples were pedestrian, traveling on foot and using dogs as pack animals. Dogs were harnessed to travois, an A-frame of poles that dragged behind, loaded with possessions. This limited mobility affected settlement patterns and material culture. People could not carry much, so possessions were minimal. Housing had to be portable. Tipis made of buffalo hides stretched over pole frameworks could be assembled and disassembled quickly, but the poles were heavy and dragging them was laborious, so moves were undertaken only when necessary. The archaeological record shows occupation extending back to Paleo-Indian times, but the density of sites increased significantly in the late prehistoric period. By 1000 CE, some groups in the eastern plains were adopting horticulture, growing corn, beans, and squash in river valleys. These semi-sedentary farming communities, like the Mandan and Hidatsa along the Missouri River, lived in earth lodges, substantial dome-shaped structures built over deep pits, with frameworks of logs covered with layers of willow branches, grass, and earth. The earth lodge villages became centers of trade. The farmers produced surplus corn that they traded to more nomadic hunting groups for meat and hides. Shells from the Pacific coast, obsidian from the Rockies, native copper from the Great Lakes, and finished goods from various regions all passed through these trading centers. When Europeans began exploring the plains in the 18th century, they found complex networks of exchange already operating. The arrival of horses, beginning in the late 1600s, as animals escaped from Spanish settlements in the southwest, spread northward through trading and raiding, transformed plains life. Horses provided mobility that had never been possible. Mounted hunters could pursue buffalo herds over long distances, killing animals with arrows shot from horseback. Horses could carry far more than dogs. Within a few generations, an equestrian culture emerged on the plains, one that would become iconic in American imagination. But the pre-horse cultures of the plains, those that existed for thousands of years before European contact, were sophisticated in their own right. They developed technologies and strategies perfectly suited to pedestrian buffalo hunting. They maintained social networks across vast distances. They created artistic traditions, expressed in painted hides, beadwork, and carved bone. They told stories and sang songs that transmitted knowledge across generations, where the best hunting grounds were, how to predict weather, which plants had medicinal properties, the proper ways to conduct ceremonies that ensured the buffalo would return each year. The spiritual life of plains peoples was intimately connected to the buffalo. Many creation stories explained how buffalo came to exist for the benefit of humans. Ceremonies sought to ensure successful hunts, and to show respect for the animals that gave their lives. The sun dance, practiced by many plains groups, involved dancers who fasted and underwent physical trials, seeking visions and spiritual power. These ceremonies reinforced community bonds and maintained the reciprocal relationship between humans and the natural world. Vision quests were central to individual spiritual development. Young men and sometimes women would travel alone to isolated places, hilltops, rock outcroppings, places of power, where they would fast for days, praying for a vision that would grant them personal power and guidance. These vision experiences shaped individuals' paths through life, giving them confidence, direction, and connection to spiritual forces. The rock art of the plains preserves some of this spiritual dimension. Petroglyphs, images pecked into rock surfaces, and pictographs, paintings on stone, appear at locations throughout the region. Some depict buffalo and other animals, hunting scenes, warriors. Others show geometric patterns, handprints, or figures that may represent spirits or beings from vision experiences. Many sites were used repeatedly over centuries or millennia, creating palimpsests that span thousands of years. By the time of European contact, the Great Plains supported a rich diversity of peoples: the Blackfeet, Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, and many others, each with distinctive languages and cultural practices, yet all sharing adaptations to the grassland environment and the central role of buffalo. The story of these peoples in the centuries following European contact, the horse culture era, the conflicts with expanding American settlement, the near extinction of buffalo herds by the 1880s, the confinement to reservations, is one of the most tragic in North American history. But the deeper history, the thousands of years during which plains peoples developed their distinctive lifeways, successfully harvesting the bounty of the grasslands in sustainable ways, represents an achievement worthy of recognition and respect. As we reach the end of this journey through the deep past of North America, we find ourselves standing at a threshold between ancient and modern, between the archaeological record and living memory, between what has been lost and what endures. The first Americans arriving at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, set in motion a process of adaptation and diversification that would eventually produce hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and ways of life, each perfectly tuned to particular environments and circumstances. From the Arctic to the subtropics, from coastal waters to inland deserts, indigenous peoples developed sophisticated knowledge systems, technologies, social organizations, and spiritual traditions that allowed them not merely to survive but to flourish. The archaeological sites that remain, cliff dwellings, burial mounds, stone circles, petroglyphs, village sites marked by subtle depressions in the earth, are fragments of this vast human story. They are places where we can still touch the past, where the material evidence of ancient lives emerges from soil and stone. Walking through the ruins of Pueblo Bonito, or standing atop Monk's Mound, examining Clovis points in museum collections, or viewing Hopewell copperwork, we confront the ingenuity and artistry of people who lived millennia ago, yet who faced challenges remarkably similar to our own: how to feed families, how to live sustainably in a particular place, how to create meaning and beauty, how to pass knowledge to the next generation. But archaeological sites and artifacts, however impressive, tell only part of the story. They give us chronologies and subsistence patterns, trade networks and technological sequences, evidence of migrations and cultural transformations. What they cannot easily convey is the lived experience of being human in these ancient contexts, the The songs sung while processing salmon, the stories told around evening fires, the emotions felt when burying a child or celebrating a successful hunt, the dreams and fears and hopes that motivated daily life. For these aspects of the past, we must rely on ethnography, on the cultural practices and oral traditions that survived into the period of written documentation, recognizing that these later traditions may differ significantly from ancient practices yet still preserve echoes of older patterns. The indigenous peoples encountered by European explorers and settlers were not living fossils, unchanged since time immemorial, but dynamic societies that had continued to develop and change right up to the moment of contact. The cultures documented by ethnographers, the potlatches of the northwest coast, the buffalo hunts of the plains, the agricultural practices of the southeast, represented adaptations and innovations that in many cases were relatively recent. Behind them lay thousands of years of cultural development, population movements, technological changes, all now largely invisible, except where archaeology can illuminate them. The arrival of Europeans initiated a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, swept through populations with devastating effect. Mortality rates reached 90% or higher in some regions. Entire communities disappeared. Knowledge holders died before they could pass their wisdom to the next generation. Trade networks collapsed. Political systems disintegrated. The population of the Americas, estimated at 50 to 100 million at the time of contact, crashed to perhaps 5 million by the late 16th century in one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. The cultural impact was equally devastating. European colonization brought displacement from traditional territories, disruption of subsistence patterns, suppression of languages and religions, forced assimilation policies, and outright genocide in some cases. Sacred sites were desecrated, burial grounds were looted, children were taken from families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. By the late 19th century, many predicted the complete disappearance of indigenous peoples and cultures. Yet, indigenous peoples and cultures persisted. Despite everything, disease, warfare, removal, suppression, communities survived, adapted, and maintained connections to their ancestral traditions. Languages continued to be spoken, even if by dwindling numbers of elders. Ceremonies continued to be performed, even if in secret or in modified forms. Whole traditions continued to be passed down, and in recent decades, there has been a remarkable resurgence of indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. A conscious effort by indigenous communities to reclaim their heritage, to revitalize what was nearly lost, to assert their continuing presence and rights. Modern archaeology increasingly operates in partnership with indigenous communities, recognizing that descendants have rights and interests in the study and interpretation of their ancestors' sites and remains. This collaboration has enriched archaeological understanding, while also empowering communities to control their own histories. The reinterpretation of sites like Cahokia, Chaco Canyon, and Mesa Verde through indigenous perspectives has revealed layers of meaning that purely archaeological approaches often missed. Indigenous sciences, detailed knowledge of plants, animals, weather patterns, landscape processes accumulated over millennia, are increasingly recognized as valuable not only for understanding the past, but for addressing present challenges. Traditional ecological knowledge informs modern conservation efforts. Native plant management techniques are being revived to restore degraded landscapes. Fire management practices that indigenous peoples used for thousands of years are being relearned and applied. The languages of North America's indigenous peoples, hundreds of which were spoken at the time of contact, contain vast amounts of cultural information, place names that encode knowledge about resources and hazards, kinship terms that reflect social organization, grammatical structures that embody particular ways of understanding reality. Many of these languages are now extinct or spoken by only a few elders. But language revitalization programs are working to reverse this loss. Communities are creating teaching materials, establishing immersion schools, using technology to preserve and disseminate linguistic knowledge. The story of the first Americans does not end with contact and colonization. It continues in the more than 5 million people in the United States and Canada who identify as indigenous, in the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and 634 First Nations in Canada, in the indigenous governed territories and reservations where traditional governance systems operate. It continues in the artists who work in traditional media, basketry, beadwork, carving, as well as contemporary forms, creating art that expresses both continuity with the past and engagement with the present. It continues in ceremonies and dances performed in community centers and at ancient sites, in gatherings where families reunite and elders share stories, in the slow, patient work of teaching young people the skills and knowledge that previous generations learned from their own elders. It continues in political activism, struggles for land rights, water rights, treaty enforcement, environmental protection of sacred sites, recognition of sovereignty. It continues in the simple act of indigenous people remaining on their ancestral lands or returning to them, maintaining the relationship with place that has always been central to indigenous identity. When we look at the ruins of Chaco Canyon, or stand in the forest, where a Hopewell earthwork still rises above the surrounding terrain, we are not just looking at the past, we are looking at the foundations of living cultures, at the deep roots of communities that still exist, still maintain connections to these places, still tell stories about them, still feel responsibility for them. The first Americans did not vanish into history. They remain, their descendants walking the same landscapes. Their ancestors knew 10,000 years ago, carrying forward traditions of resilience and adaptation that allowed humans to thrive in North America long before anyone imagined building cities in Europe or planting crops in the Fertile Crescent. The story we have traced, from the first crossings of Beringia to the mound builders of the eastern woodlands, from Clovis hunters to the architects of Cahokia and Chaco, from Arctic maritime specialists to Pacific coast seafarers, is a story of human achievement spanning 15 millennia or more. It is a story that reminds us that civilization did not originate in a single place and spread outward, but emerged independently in many locations as humans solved the challenges of living together in increasing numbers and complexity. It is a story that demonstrates the human capacity for innovation, for adapting to diverse environments, for creating beauty and meaning under any circumstances. And it is a story that continues, written now not just by archaeologists and historians, but by indigenous people themselves, reclaiming their histories, telling their stories in their own voices, asserting their presence and their rights. The past is not dead and gone, but lives on in memory, in tradition, in the continuation of cultures that have endured for thousands of years, and will endure into a future we cannot yet imagine. As darkness falls across the continent tonight, in countless places, reservations and reserves, urban Indian centers and rural communities, ancient sites and new territories, indigenous people gather, speak their languages, tell their stories, maintain their connections to land and ancestors. The threads that connect present to past, that link the first Americans who crossed Beringia to their descendants living today, remain unbroken despite everything. And as long as those threads persist, as long as memory and tradition continue to be passed from one generation to the next, the story of the first Americans goes on, alive and unfinished, extending forward into time, as far as it reaches back into the mists of the Ice Age, when humans first set foot on this land and began the long process of making it home.